today's edition of Pegasus Test. On today's edition, we're covering the enemy. And how do you find out the enemy? Well, as Sun Tzu once said, know yourself and know your enemy, and the outcome of 1,000 battles is never in question. But the big question is, how do you find out about the enemy? What does he do? What does he know? And how does he fight? And for that, I'm going to turn over to Doc Larson here to explain what's in front of us here on the table.
So let's follow up before we get here. Let's follow up about your Sun Tzu quote because, I think that just resonates with all of us. The issue here, and Les and I have seen this time and time again through our military service, is that when we go out to fight against a bad guy, let's say our rifle company is going out and we're going to fight against another rifle company. It doesn't matter what we call that rifle company. We can call them, they're Soviets, or they're, Nicaraguan guerrillas, It doesn't matter what we call them. And we can even throw some different clothing on them. Heck, we could even give them an AK-47 instead of an AR-15. But the point is, how do they behave?
Just like U.S. infantry.
Just like U.S. infantry. They task organize themselves, their structure. They have, identical equipment. Even their logistics. Are they carrying around bags of rice to heat in the jungle? Nope. What are they carrying? MREs, exactly. So everything they do, their command structure, their culture, their decision making, their tactics, everything they do is Blue 4. Is U.S. By the way, this doesn't just plague the United States Armed Forces. When we talk to the British and the German Army, guess what they report? When they fight their sister units, the British Army pretends like the British Army. And the German Army, Opfor, pretends like the German Army. So the Germans get used to fighting the Germans, the Russian gets used to fighting the Russians, and the Americans get used to fighting Americans. And we really don't know how the enemy fights. So, working with the Lightning Press, I went to Norm Wade and said, way back in the day, I want to say it was like 2008, 2009, I said, Norm, what we need to do is we need to create a series of Opfor books with the expressed intent to help not just the huge national training centers like NTC at Fort Irwin or JRTC at Fort Polk or JMRC at Hohenfels, Germany, and there's others as well. The Marines have training centers, and the Brits, the South Koreans, the Aussies, the Hungarians have training centers, for crying out loud. But there are those huge training centers. Yes, of course, we wanted to appeal to them, but we also wanted to appeal all the way down to those battalion level training officers and NCOs saying, okay, well, I've got to plan my training calendar 18 months in advance. We wanted to give them a resource to say, okay, what are you fighting in 12 months from now? Well, we're going to fight a guerrilla force. Okay, are they a very capable guerrilla force, something akin to the Japanese in World War II who had to step down from conventional army to a guerrilla force because their logistics were cut off? Is it an incredibly capable, structured, disciplined guerrilla force? Or is it something mid-level? No, this is more about this, insurgency that went to a guerrilla army that then, developed, let's say, something like Castro's, in Cuba, how they became from insurgency and graduated up to a guerrilla army? Is it something like mid-capability like that? Or is this something a very, very low-capable guerrilla force that's really working with crime cartels because that's how they get their funding, right? Either doing hostages and kidnapping and, for money, or selling drugs or something like this. So they're working with crime cartels. What level of guerrilla force do you want? Well, let's create a book that says you can do this at this level, this level, this level. And if you think that's true of guerrilla force, then we can say that's true of red team armies. Hell, we could say that's true of Chinese military, of Russian military today. They have their most capable, their mid-capable, and their least capable units. Which one do you want to represent? Do you want to represent elements from each of those levels so that you know how to fight those? That's what we set forward to do. This discussion starts in 2008, 2009. We start building essentially what has now become 3 and 5, and that's where I was tasked to build. Number 3 is Opfor 3 is Red Team Armies. Opfor 5 is Irregular and Hybrid Threat. That includes your insurgents and guerrillas. So we started building these, but of course, what really happens is Russia really starts to exercise its weight in Georgia. It starts like bullying its neighbors. This is even after Chechnya, the Second Chechen War, which it has an incursion into Georgia. We're going, oh man, do we need to deal with that? So I'm trying to write number 5 while I'm also writing number 3, and then the whole fiasco happens in 2014 with Russia going into Crimea, and Norm Wade had kind of said, look, I think we've got to put Red Team Army first, and so the first edition of Red Team Army literally came out in 2014 because of the fiasco of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And so it came out, and matters of fact, it came out then, its second, I think this is its second edition. Yeah, this is a second edition, and it came out, give me a second, in 2019. So 2014, 2019, it's already in its second edition. And that's the only one that stayed out there for years, right? But we were waiting for the military to produce certain types of documents. What you don't want to do is you don't want to produce something like Opfor 2 North Korea, have the military do a release, and that just absolutely is not, copacetic with what we're saying, right?
Right. I mean, as we've said in previous videos, these are the cliff notes of your Army FNs. This is to be in your cargo pocket because you can't fit 22 frickin' field manuals in a fag bag.
Exactly. So, and this does the same thing, but that's a critical point. In writing Opfor 3, Red Team Armies, which, by the way, is predicated on Soviet doctrine. Yes, I said Soviet, not by mistake. It's predicated on Soviet doctrine as it's applied by the modern day Russian, Chinese, Cuban, Venezuelan, Iranian, North Korean. It really is kind of the catch-all because it was our first one. And so this is the second edition. By the time this hits third edition, which we're waiting, honestly, Lightning Press has told me quite clearly, we're waiting for some culmination of Ukraine. Then we're going to make commentary on the Russian forces. This will become Opfor 3 Russian forces. It will no longer be called Red Team Army because, as you can see, we're expanding to specific titles for those other Red Team armies.
And that's an interesting point because here in number 1 you've got the Chinese military, number 2 is North Korean, 3 is Red Team Army, and while they all come from the same doctrinal place, they do apply it all very differently.
Very differently. And in trying to cover all of that in one title, I think wasn't doing us great service because people rightfully said, hey, is this modern? Hey, is this contemporary? Hey, does this apply evenly across all spectrums? No. Cuba does it very, very different than North Korea. And I'll tell you what, North Korea and China are not similar at all, right? Not at all. You'd think the proximity and the fact that their influence over each other, but oh, good Lord, no. North Korean are just maniacs, right? They're just very, very draconian. And Chinese and Russian aren't the same at all. As a general, here, I give you just one cultural difference of a myriad that we could speak of. Russia will take, as it took Crimea, with very, very limited violence, right? Almost no violence, if it can. And it knows how it benefits. It goes, wow, we took that territory with all infrastructure intact. But when Russia starts to lose, as you've seen throughout Ukraine this year, they have no qualms about going right back to their doctrine of leveling cities, just destroying all infrastructure. That's abhorrent to the Chinese. The Chinese are like, what's the point, in their thinking, what's the point of me breaking into your house to steal your money, then taking your cash, setting it on the living room floor, and burning it all? The Chinese don't understand that. Where the Russians say, well, but I still stole all your money. We're like, wow. So these two have all of them have very, very different ways of thinking about it. And now, of course, what should be the elephant in the room is you're going 1, 2, 3, 5. I was infantry, but I can still count to 5. There's a 4 missing, and that's Iran. Okay. So, will we ever cover Venezuela and Cuba, things like that? Will we ever cover some of the African communist countries? Possibly. They are covered in vignettes, by the way. But
right. The name Red Team Army because they're coming from that same basis.
That's it.
That same core knowledge.
That's it. So again, this will eventually, think of this now as the precursor to the Russian army, right? But it's actually covering much more. Where this is, of course, your Chinese military, your North Korean military. Again, your Iranian military is coming. We didn't release it, and we don't know how. Honestly, we're anticipating it might be a few years, because again, you don't want to release things and then have the U.S. doctor come out and say, well, we disagree. So we're waiting on that. Number 4. But this will be Russian, and then you had a catch-all. So before we go into this one, so my work, I should say that the Chinese military Opfor 1, the North Korean military Opfor 2, and the Opfor 4, which will be the Iranian military, they are not my works. I mean, I certainly did influence that through different discussions, through the initial work, but they're not my books. Those aren't my titles. You won't see my name on it. Those are strictly Norm Wade, Lieutenant Colonel retired Norm Wade. My titles are specifically Opfor 3, Red Team Armies, and Opfor 5, Irregular and Hybrid Threat. So, but these were just released together. So finally, we have 4 of the 5 in the, just a couple of weeks ago, we have 4 of the 5 in the series, and so that's just a wonderful thing. So this is a big win for us. Now, the other thing that's so unique about these, one small note, is that you'll notice it's not spiral bound. They are still carried the same size, they carry in a pocket and everything else, but they're not spiral bound because we decided, probably you're not teaching and planning out of this, right?
So this is schoolroom books.
Yeah, these are schoolroom books, learning how to do and how to think, in those contexts. So that's the first thing you'll see, and that's a pretty nuanced thing. The bigger thing is when you go in here and you say, oh, what 22 field manuals am I using here? Army publications, and you see Army publications. For the first time ever, you see a second set saying other publications. Yeah, other resources. This was one of my wins with, and it wasn't a hard-fought one. The Lightning Press got this right away when I said, hey, we can't talk about Opfor purely from a U.S. perspective. We've got to go out and get open source resources, and they agreed. Lightning Press was like, yeah, absolutely we do. This is a rare case, but all of these do that. They go outside your normal. Now, we still, again, half the sources are still within the U.S. Publications and the U.S. community. So there's a few things that happened that was really interesting there. We had to go out to other sources, like I said, and so that sets us apart. But the other thing was, we've had some modest success with this title, and we're hoping to repeat that with the others. It didn't go as planned. These are purchased through the national training centers, right? There is publication there, but they're not purchasing and distributing it to their students coming in. And that was a real disappointment for us. Furthermore, so what I'm saying is we lost that 70% of sales that we were expecting for these so far hasn't materialized. The 30% of soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors going, I better understand this, that still has very much materialized for us. But we did have a minor win, and it kind of unnerved us at first, because this is all hypothetical. This is not, it did not start as intel. It started as, let's talk about hypothetical, fictional Opfor that are authentic, realistic enough to be authentic. But the intel community is our big buyer here. And so that's why is there a second edition? That's really what shaped this series, was recognizing that because we went outside the U.S. doctrine to collect open source intel. this had a great appeal to the intelligence community and not just Department of Defense. So that's a feather in our cap, is that intel communities, international intel communities, are saying, government agencies are saying, yeah, buddy, we think you're close enough. And so they're taking this and they're using that. And so again, that's a feather in our cap, even though Norm and I kind of looked at each other and went, uh-oh. I don't, really? Because, okay, this is open source. Why are you looking to us? So what we surmise, okay, and this is a big guess, but it's a pretty informed guess, is that the reason this became so important to Intel is exactly because the Lightning Press allowed us to use open source. And what I mean by that is, we have not had think about it, breadth and depth, right? So the breadth is, how many different types of Opfor militaries are you considering? And the depth is, how deep do you go? Is it strategy? Is it strategy and operations? Is it strategy, operations, and then tactics way down there? Are you getting to battle drill and what weapon systems they're carrying? Things like that, right? So boom, depth and then breadth. This hasn't been done comprehensively literally since FM 100 series in 1980 to 82. They had a three-book FM series. And the military promised this in the 90s, but they failed to deliver. They did a strategic look, and it was pretty haphazard. Then in 2010 and 2015, they've released others that are far better at the breadth. They are far more encompassing, saying, okay, what's the hybrid threat, right, across the spectrum? But they weren't real deep. They stayed up at strategy, and where they went into, and I mean, they did it effectively. I'm not taking away from them. They did it brilliantly, but they defined that. But where they went into operation, they didn't go operations. It's not like they went completely across the board and said, okay, operations of each one, tactics of each one. They didn't do that. It's operations real spottily and almost zero effort to get into the tactics, to take that bold step and say, okay, here's how they're actually getting things done, right? So they stay at that strategic level very comfortably, but only meander into the operational. And where they do it credibly, but they don't go across the board. So what we're looking at here is breadth and depth. These books go all the way down to tactics, techniques, and procedures. You'll get into battle drills here, okay?
Excellent.
And we've, through different sources, we've vindicated this, we've validated this. Now it's anecdotal, but nonetheless, we're validating and vindicating this through many different sources. And I think it is those open sources outside of U.S. military publications. And I think because we're doing that this became the aha. This is what the military hasn't delivered in 40 years. They have not delivered this in 40 years. And so this just quickly became, that's our go-to for the intel community.
Outstanding.
Yeah. Again, a feather in our cap. And man, I'm telling you, I'm so happy to have this out here because, again, this all started, again, back with conversations between myself and Norm Wade with the Lightning Press, all the way back. We were talking about the other day, and he's like, I said 2011. He's like, no. He's like, man, we started this back in 2008, 2009. And I'm like, yeah, it's been a long build. But I'm really glad to see, even though it's not quite complete, I'm really glad to see this out there. And yes, look for continued improvement on this over the coming years, particularly this one, which will become, Opfor 3 will become Russian forces.
And a question on that, since Opfor 3 will become Russian forces, will there then be another one to just cover everybody else to pick up that? Because Red Team Army is covering that, for lack of a better term, Soviet doctrine that everybody else is employing. That will there kind of be a catch-all manual for everybody else?
You know, that's a fair question. Right now for us, Opfor 5 is that catch-all, and it doesn't cover Red Team Army. So you're right. I see what you're saying. There's a catch-all right now for Red Team armies, right? That's peer and near-peer fighting. Be it, again, Cuba, North Korea, China, Russia, whatever. So there is that catch-all. But I don't know that we're going to do that because we're breaking them out. Now, what you might see eventually is a Venezuela and a Cuban book, right? You might eventually see something like that, the Republic of the Congo, right? Something like this. You could, but our catch-all right now is Opfor 5, which again started as guerrilla and insurgent forces, so it starts at that, as they all do. They all start with a cultural primer, because these people make decisions very, very different than we make decisions, because they have a different culture. Culture is, when you really get down to the brass tacks, it's this. Culture is developed around how we do things. So it doesn't matter if you hunt, you fish, you basket weave, or you make war. How we do things is how culture evolves, and they have very, very different solution sets that are logical to their conditions, right? That they get things done. And so it's not stupid, even though it's very different from how we do it. And so you start with that cultural primer to say, don't think like Blue 4, think like X, okay? So that's where you start. Well, for us, the Opfor 5 really does that. We start with the insurgent life cycle, and the insurgent life cycle starts from political action. Literally political action committees, legitimate political action, and how that morphs into insurgency, how that morphs into guerrilla warfare, and from there you either move towards a conventional force or you digress into crime cartels. Okay, you either win or you lose, and you go that way. So it starts to branch and sequel, and this is very well discussed here, but it doesn't stay at that life cycle view. We then look at strategic levels. Why are these forces working together? Why will they work with red team armies? Why will they work against red team armies? How have working against various red team armies shaped how they run operations and tactics? And you can see the relation inside of 5 to the other 4 books. So for us, this is the catch-all right now, but I see what you're saying. There almost should be one higher up, right? Like a book 0, right? That captures all of it. And, I think...
Yeah, an army trained by Russian advisors is going to fight like a Russian army, but they will put their own spin on it, whatever that spin may be, depending on their cultural, logistical, and support means.
That's true. That's true. And so... right now, it's funny you asked that, because that's actually one thing that Norm and I had originally discussed, was that number 1 would be this overview. It would become the overview. But as we looked more and more at it, we said, nah, they're not we need to not think of them as, the sum of all the parts, but actually start thinking of them as, no, that's a part, that's a part, that's a part, and that's a part, right? So that's our answer now. How will this change over time? That's a fair question.
And a question about number 3. You've written the book, and now Ukraine's happened. Have you seen any big major Russian departure from what is their tactics as predicted in the book?
If I can say so, not at all. They played it exactly as we called it. When we talk about unconventional warfare, I shouldn't say not at all. There's a couple of risks they took that are very, very much against their own doctrine. But for the most part, they played it the way we think. Putin expected, I think most people have concluded, that Putin expected another Crimea when he initially entered at the end of February this year into Ukraine, right? He thought he was going to have a cakewalk. And that plays into their unconventional warfare. By the way, there's different levels of unconventional warfare that are expressed in the 3rd book. And so you could see what he was doing. You could clearly, reading this book, go, I see what you're doing. And then when it didn't work, he went, oh, you want to play hardball? Well, let's fall back. And so the leveling of cities, again, comes right out through there. It's right through their playbook. There were some risks that were very atypical that he took. And I'll give you one clear example. Vertical envelopment and air assets. Russians don't do it the American way, which Kiev, the seizing of the airport north of Kiev in the early days of the war, using their vertical lift, right, your helicopters, using that so deep, going hundreds of miles in, is absolutely against their doctrine. That really does fly in the face of their doctrine. It was an enormous risk that they took, and they lost. The deep war that they're playing with their aircraft initially, that is not their doctrine. The doctrine of the Russian army is to see specifically is to see even fixed wing aircraft. Okay, you have your fighters, right? You have your tactical attack bombers and stuff like that. They see those as artillery. They don't see them the way we see them, as glorious knights on, on their steed to do battle and turning curves and launching missiles at each other. That is that is, and I love the movie Maverick, loved it. Top Gun, loved, and I saw that this summer. But that is such a NATO Western view of aircraft. That is not the Russian doctrine at all. They see, for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, they see their tactical aircraft as artillery. And so when they were punching deep in and taking those risks and getting shot out of the sky, particularly with slow-moving rotary wing, helicopters, this was very much, I have to wonder who is in control there. Is it Wagner Group, which is so, really trying to westernize? Is that who was in control there and who planned that out? Because, that's not Russian doctrine. And to be honest, that's even risky for American doctrine. Let's take a minute and go back another 30 years. Go back to 1991, the Persian Gulf War. The 101st Airborne sent a brigade north, airlifted a brigade with helicopters and thrust them 200-300 miles north, right, to cut off the retreating Iraqi army. And that was controversial. It wound up working wonderfully. One, because we had air dominance. Two, because we had seeded, that is, suppression of enemy air defenses. We had seeded so incredibly well. But it worked for other reasons as well. And yet, even at the time that we did that, this was phenomenally controversial. And, because it worked, everybody goes, oh, that was neat. And that's all, it gets a footnote. Oh, that was neat. Well, no, it was far more than neato. It was hair-raising. Right? So we violated our own doctrine there. And you see the Russians do this in Kiev. And the onset of the war this year, the onset of the war is 2014, we all know that. But I'm saying the second invasion.
Component.
Yes, the second invasion. You see them do that. And I have to admit, I was a bit mortified and fascinated at the same time. I'm like, how is this going to go for them? How is this going to go? They've got a vertical insertion to seize an airstrip, which they did successfully. But they couldn't hold it because their air bridge, their vertical lift capabilities were taking such a beating. And I was like, yeah, you violated your own doctrine there.
Yeah, interesting fact, because I'm not the world's preeminent military historian, but I think this is the first major airborne operation to fail since Market Garden.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that. Wow.
But as I try to think of historical things that have happened since then, I can't find an airborne operation that's failed.
No, you're right, because the few that happened in Korea all wound up being, although there's some touch and go there, but they wound up being successes.
They were successful.
Junction City
was successful.
Successful.
Everything the Israelis did was successful.
The Israeli, Pakistani, and
the
the Swat
Rhodesian
Valley
operations.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean,
can't find the one that failed.
No, there's one even in Ethiopia fighting Somalia in the late 70s where the Cubans, with Russian assets, airlifted. It's the only air assault mechanized. This is phenomenal. It's pretty small scale. The Cubans put their BMDs, hooked them up to Soviet heavy lift helicopters, and air assaulted into the flanks of the Somalis, who were very, very capable military in the late 70s. And their paratroopers were holed up in the mountains, holding off the Ethiopians, the Cubans, the Russians, the East Germans. I mean, this list of communist countries trying to attack them. They're very capably holding them off until they air assaulted mechanized forces into their flank, and then the Somali force crumbled. But even that was a success, right? Yeah, so you raise a good point. That
I cannot think of a major air mobile operation, airborne air mobile, that has failed since Market Garden.
Huh?
And it seems to have failed for the exact same reason. Market Garden fails because the British airborne takes on them, but 30 Corps never relieves them. And it looks like in the Ukrainian example, the relief forces didn't even get as close as 30 Corps did, because 30 Corps at least got to the point their artillery could help the battle.
Right.
The Russians never even got to that point.
No, I think you're right. I think it was a big gamble thinking, well, this we're going to be welcomed. We just got to fight local Ukrainian military. Once we defeat them, the general population is going to welcome us. And in fact, they thought that would expedite the ground forces, the big push from the north down south, and it didn't. It didn't. You're right. They got cut off. They got slowed down, and they lost that battle. And so that's an astute observation. You're right. I think that might be the first battlefield loss for that. And you can see it's because it's so textbook, right? We don't take these huge risks anymore, that we did in D-Day and that we did in Market Garden. But we did actually in Iraq, and it turned out to our, in our favor. It didn't work so well for the Russians. Yeah, interesting. So do I see something? Yeah, there's an example of something that I see that they did violate their playbook, but for the most part, no, they're playing this by their playbook. Yeah, very much so.
Interesting. Well, if you want to know what your enemy's going to do, these are the books you need to check out. Doc, where can they get them?
They can get them, again, you can find all these on Amazon, but I shouldn't even say that, so pretend I didn't. Where you want to get these is thelightningpress.com, because again, they are in hard copy, they are in digital copy, and you can bundle them any which way you want, and you'll get savings on that.
Outstanding. We'd like to thank you for tuning in today. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and tune in for future book reviews.